Hello, everybody. RJM3 here, and today we're going to be talking about one of the most controversial conflicts of the 20th century. What if the US won the Vietnam War?
Before we get into the alternate history, let's talk about the actual history. So back in the 1880s, the French had colonized Indochina in Southeast Asia, consisting of modern-day Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. In 1940, after the fall of France in World War II, the Empire of Japan invaded French Indochina. It is around this time that anti-colonial Vietnamese communist Ho Chi Minh founded the Viet Minh, an underground communist insurgency meant to combat the Japanese occupation. Indochina would remain under Japanese control until the end of the war in 1945. Shortly after the war, the Viet Minh had decided to turn their attention towards fighting the reinstated French occupation. This was the start of the First Indochina War, from 1946 to 1954. You'd think this colonial uprising would be easily suppressed, but the French being the French did as terrible a job as you'd imagine. The war formally ended with the 1954 Geneva Conference. While Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia did get their independence, Vietnam, however, was also split in two, a communist North Vietnam and a non-communist South Vietnam. Why was Vietnam split in two, you might ask? Well, Ho Chi Minh and his Communist Party had a lot of support in the northern portion of Vietnam. Also, diplomats from the USSR and People's Republic of China were present at the Geneva Conference. So it was agreed that Vietnam would be temporarily divided until a unification election in 1956, where it would be decided by the Vietnamese people what kind of government they wanted. However, the government of South Vietnam knew that the North had a much higher population and would easily win any election, so they refused to hold said election and the division remained. So yeah, the Geneva Conference was literal garbage. Unsurprisingly, conflict between the two Vietnams erupted and began the Second Indochina War, or as most people call it, the Vietnam War. The North took the initiative and went on the offensive to unite the country. From the mid-50s to the mid-60s, U.S. interest in the conflict slowly grew with each new president. It wasn't until 1964, under President Lyndon B. Johnson, did the U.S. fully get involved in the conflict due to the Gulf of Tonkin incident. Following his re-election, LBJ began sending troops into Vietnam in March of 1965. Another reason the U.S. got involved in the conflict was the Domino Theory. The theory claimed that if Vietnam completely fell to communism, then communism would quickly spread across the rest of East Asia and engulf the continent. America's overall objective in the conflict wasn't to unite Vietnam under the South, but rather just to keep the South independent from the Communist North. Johnson's initial strategy to defeat the North Vietnamese was to have American troops safeguard and defend the South from the North Vietnamese Army and the South Vietnamese communist insurgency known as the Viet Cong. While that was happening, the U.S. Air Force would bomb the absolute shit out of North Vietnam. With this, Johnson hoped North Vietnam would quickly submit. Unfortunately for him, they didn't. Johnson had greatly underestimated the North Vietnamese's resolve for victory. Every time the U.S. bombed a factory or base, the North Vietnamese rebuilt. Every time the U.S. bombed a trail or road, the North Vietnamese changed routes. To make the situation in Vietnam worse, the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong knew they couldn't just directly confront the U.S. Army, and rarely did so. Instead, they chose to wage a guerrilla war on the Americans while relying on much simpler technology. What should have been a quick win quickly became a war of attrition. Johnson's credibility and popularity soon plummeted. American public opinion turned against the war and demanded a withdrawal. In 1968, Richard Nixon was elected to be the next U.S. president on the promise of getting America out of Vietnam. The last American troops withdrew from Vietnam in 1973. With a combination of poor leadership and no American forces to back them up, the South Vietnamese capital, Saigon, fell to the North in 1975, and the war ended with the North Vietnamese victory and unification under communism. Contrary to what the Domino Theory assumed, communism did not spread across East Asia after the fall of South Vietnam. You see, the reason North Vietnamese resolve was so great was because from their point of view, they saw the Americans as foreign invaders occupying land which they saw as rightfully theirs, and nothing really unites a country better than a foreign invasion. So the North Vietnamese didn't really see this as a fight for communism, but rather a fight for their country. For them, communism was only seen as an alternative to colonialism. Of course, I'm not agreeing or siding with the North Vietnamese here. Ho Chi Minh's regime was tyrannical and ruthless, just like any other communist state. Not to mention their war effort to unite Vietnam caused plenty of unneeded human suffering for soldiers and civilians alike. Their resolve was great, but awfully misguided. One more thing to mention before we get into any alternate history is that while the US never won the Vietnam War, it wouldn't be quite fair to say that the US lost it either. While the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong's relentlessness did turn public opinion against the war, their attacks often really weren't so successful. Even the Tet Offensive, while having dealt the greatest depletion of American morale, was still a tactical failure. Not to mention the North Vietnamese didn't really achieve their goals of unification until after America exited the conflict. So America didn't necessarily lose the Vietnam War, rather we just never secured victory. While we didn't prevent the fall of South Vietnam, at least we can say we delayed it. With all that said, let's get into the scenario. Remember earlier when I said the US's main goal during the war was just to keep the North and South separate? Well, this plan was doomed to fail from the start. There was absolutely no deterring the North from annexing the South. The only way the United States ever could have won the Vietnam War and thoroughly defeated the Communists was to turn the tables and invade the North and unify Vietnam under the South. However, it isn't that simple either. You see, North Vietnam was recognized by both the Soviet Union and China, so invading North Vietnam runs the risk of inciting a Third World War. But there's really no other way South Vietnam and the US could have won the war, so that'll be the divergence point we're going with. So to be completely fair, I'll be going over two alternate timelines in this video. One where the Russians and Chinese don't retaliate, and one where they do. Let's start with the one where they don't. We begin in 1965. President Johnson has opted to forgo a solely defensive strategy. Shortly after a good number of American troops arrive in South Vietnam, the U.S. would declare war on North Vietnam. American forces cross the border and invade the country. The invasion would be hard-fought and bloody. The North Vietnamese would fight back against the invasion in the jungles, in the villages, and in the cities, but would inevitably be overwhelmed. Hanoi would eventually fall, and Ho Chi Minh's regime would be ousted. The North would be annexed by the South, ending the war with a decisive South Vietnamese and American victory. However, even with the victory, there would still be a large underground communist insurgency in Vietnam. The U.S. would still have to leave some troops behind to quell the insurgency, at least until the Vietnamese government could get its act together and be able to deal with the problem on its own. With control over the entire country and its resources, I think the South would eventually be able to accomplish this. After stability is attained, Vietnam could either begin the road to democracy or remain a dictatorship. With the decisive success in Vietnam, the American public would proudly celebrate this victory against the Red Menace. The public would have never lost faith in the war, leading to a much weaker counterculture movement. The victory in Vietnam would save Johnson's popularity, which would give him the confidence needed to run for re-election in 1968. With no ongoing conflict in Vietnam, Richard Nixon wouldn't be able to run on a platform of ending U.S. involvement, so victory would be easily given to Johnson. I cannot predict what his last term would be like or what presidents would come next, but what I can predict is that without the failure in Vietnam, the American public would certainly be much more pro-war in this alternate timeline. The U.S. could even go to war with Iran over the hostage crisis, and the U.S. could much more likely go all out in the Gulf War and overthrow Saddam Hussein in 1991. Aside from raising tensions with Russia and China, the American victory in Vietnam likely wouldn't have any long-term effects on the Cold War, and would likely still end in the early 90s with the collapse of the Soviet Union. Anyway, now it's time to talk about the timeline where the Soviet Union and China do retaliate. Shortly after the invasion begins, the Soviets send an ultimatum to the US to stop the invasion. Johnson ignores it, thinking it's a bluff. The Soviets and Chinese fire up their nuclear arsenals and launch multiple nuclear attacks across Western Europe, Asia, and North America. America and the rest of NATO launch their nukes in response. In just a few hours, many parts of the Northern Hemisphere have become uninhabitable nuclear wasteland. The nations of North America and Eurasia have been destroyed, and millions, possibly billions, of people have been killed. Okay, now as dark and grim as this timeline might seem, there is still an upside in all of this. Sometime around the 2030s, the power vacuum created by the nuclear war would allow me to establish the Empire of Greater New England, and we shall finally destroy Quebec once and for all.
And that's what would happen if the US won the Vietnam War. Remember to like, share, and subscribe. This has been RJM3, Alternate Historian. Have a nice day.